All right, me. It is the very end of February, and I've just finished reading The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. Um, this book, I believe, was published in 1940, off the top of my head. Would have been a very much considered a like realistic type fiction, right? Contemporary fiction of the time, right? Because it's describing events that are leading up to like 1939, right? Um, this is the second time I've read this book. First time I read it was in postmodernist American literature. So that would have been, 4 years ago at this point. I finished it today. I'll be honest, right? Because of just the way that I read this book, I don't recall much of it, right? And that's just because of me being tired from both substitute teaching in the day and then doing the rehearsal at night. So that's that. I'm gonna try my best, but the book itself, right? It go along this long stream of things of I'm probably 6-7 books in a row at this point that are all based on the American South and switching characters and poverty, right? Those three main characteristics that I seem to have read consistently throughout my life. This book itself focuses on a small town in Southern America in which we really get to explore Singer, right? Who is a deaf man who is mute. He was not always mute as described, I think, in like 3rd or 4th chapter maybe, but he is now mute. And his experiences, and then how everyone else around him interacts with him and begins to view him, right? Singer is like the linchpin to all of this, right? The Singer is the focus, right? And then all the characters around him more or less really kind of represent the different economic factions of the United States at this point in time, right? And basically far left, leaning right, far right kind of ideals, right? And Carson McCullers does a fantastic job kind of showing that in the end, really, all 4 of these people want the same thing and want to be able to interact with each other, but they don't understand how to, right? And we learn that through Singer, right? So Singer, obviously there's great irony in the name, right? Singer being the deaf mute. But what we kind of learn throughout all of this, right? We have people basically putting Singer on a pedestal because he always seems to be smiling and agreeing, but also he doesn't communicate in the same way back, right? So their reaction to him is always very, they just assume that he really gets what's going on here, right? And all of our characters view it this way, right? They all think that Singer really understands them, understands what they're trying to get him, trying to get him to understand, right? And Singer is constantly going, these people are fucking weird. I don't know, dude. Every single time it's all about a discussion about, that he's, whenever he's writing to Antopoulos, I think that's how you pronounce the other guy's name, that he just doesn't quite understand what all of these people really want. So that's that, right? So Singer's kind of like this little linchpin that's holding all this together. Everyone's kind of enforcing their own views onto Singer, right? And we see this throughout the book as well, right? Not only just through those 4 characters, but also whenever it's described, like the whole neighborhood, the whole town, right? Everyone's kind of arguing about who Singer is and what he means and what he does, and everyone's just portraying themselves onto him, right? And we see this a lot in life, right? Especially when it comes to like relationships. It's always, or there's a very strong tendency to focus on and put the traits that you want them to show, and then forget the negatives, right? And this is actually very directly expressed in the book in Singer's relationship with Antopoulos, right? Antopoulos is another deaf mute that Singer lived with for a time, and then Antopoulos was then moved to a ward of some sort, because he was getting, uncontrollable, right? And Antopoulos, from an outside perspective, we see that he's like out of control, right? He is just taking, he's just eating, he's rude in a way that is like so far beyond any sort of compassion towards anyone, right? Even, the graces that we give to people they express themselves in slightly different ways. So far beyond any of that, right? But Singer doesn't remember any of that, right? Instead, Singer only remembers these good, joyous times that he thinks that they had, right? But in reality, Singer spent his entire life mopping up and taking care of Antopoulos, right? And so Singer does to Antopoulos what everyone else does to Singer, right? So we get this kind of macrocosm, microcosm kind of relationship going on there. The book focuses a lot on economics and economic factors, right? So I talked about, how we basically get 4 different sections of the United States at this point, right? We have far left, leaning right, and then far right. And what we see is each one of them wants to make America better. Each one of them wants to, provide for everyone in some way, right? But it's all a matter of who's the in-group, who's the out-group, and then also their unwillingness to then discuss with each other, right? There's a very pivotal scene in which, as Singer describes it, they all have so much to say, but when they all arrive at the same time to Singer's door, well, they don't know how to talk to each other. They just don't get it, right? Because even though they all want to eventually end up saying the same concepts and the same things, right? They don't know how to interact with someone who's not just a sounding board to them, who's just not going to agree with them, right? And so it shows, like, as I talked about with Tennessee Williams's, right, this great American divide, right? This huge empty space that exists, right? Because we refuse to ever bridge these gaps, right? And, that still goes on to this day, right? So that's that, right? We also get a further discussion later on between, what are their names? I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but the one who I would argue represents the kind of this far left, and the one who kind of represents this leaning right idea, right? Who is the engineer, mechanic, one who works on the Flying Jimmy and whatnot, and then the other one would be the doctor, right? And what they want is kind of more or less an uprising to then get rights and get power, right? But the way they want to go about doing this is very, very different, right? the doctor wants this smaller group to show that the individual has power, and a group of individuals can come together and then march on Washington to then make change and to demonstrate, versus our engineer or mechanic who only sees that the only way to make any sort of change is on the huge scale, and to nothing's ever going to change unless millions of Americans agree to it, right? And that's it's a philosophical argument about how do we create change in economic and political reform, right? Do you have to start at the national level, or can you actually start at the local level and actually make changes that way, right? Because it's one of those things in which, as I've talked about with some other books, I don't remember which ones I talked about with, but it's the idea that like gradual change is still change. It just doesn't feel like it. As much as we would love to have these huge changes happen all the time and like big sweeping changes to the way that we work, that just isn't how things are ever going to happen, right? We have to make small incremental adjustments, right? This book, right, is also greatly focused on the idea of like loss of hope and loss of desire, loss of dreams, right? Because Singer, at the very end of part 2, takes his own life. He learns that Antopoulos is dead, has presumably been dead for a while, and he only learns once he goes to the ward to try and visit Antopoulos. And Singer, when he gets back, takes his own life. And then part 3 begins a month later, in which we get a view of each one of our 4 characters. And what we end up seeing is just this concept of like, everything has ended. All of our dreams have gone into smoke, gone into flame. And although we may be able to continue on later with our hope, right? Where we are stuck at right now is we have lost our support that we felt that we had. Right, we talk about, I'm trying to go in the order they appear in the book. Jake, I think his name is Jake, right? He's the mechanic guy. He goes into Biff's store and is effectively just talking about how he needs to get away from everything, right? He's just been involved in a huge fight, right, at the carnival type place that he works at, and they're basically blaming the entire fight, in which 2 men die, on labor agitation, right? And so he needs to get out of there as quickly as possible. He wants to continue to try to spread his word of belief in terms of economic reform, but he needs to go do it somewhere else. He still wants to be in the South, just somewhere else, right? And so he's still clinging on to this hope, but he goes without any sort of money, any sort of property, anything to help him besides his own will. Then we go to Dr. Benedict Copeland, and what's happening with him is he's basically being forced out of his home because of his age, right? He's getting too old to take care of himself. They're going to send him to the family farm, and he's going to live on the family farm for at least a little while. And really it's kind of like this just general representation of, and this is kind of Copeland's whole story throughout the entire book, is that he wants so badly for the power to be within the individual, right? He wants it so badly. It's the leaning right concept of one should be an individual and one can survive on one's own and whatnot. But as we learn, as we see, right, is that even though he wants this to happen and he wants to support the Black community, right, it takes more than just him to make those changes, right? He needs an entire support system that he just doesn't have, right, in order to hopefully make a positive impact on his community, right? And then we go to Mick. Mick is effectively more or less a stand-in for Carson McCullers, right? It's not a direct one-to-one stand-in, but it is fairly close, right? Especially when it can compare them like physically to Carson McCullers to then the way that Mick is described. Very, very similar. And you know what kind of ends up happening there is Mick has to give up all of her dreams of becoming this art type person in order just to keep her family afloat, right? Which, you know, is one of those things, right, where we talk about the lost generation of Americans, right? Really, the lost generation is not just like this loss of life and humanity, but is this loss of productivity in this way, right? The amount of ideas and things that have gone to waste because of the wars in the 20th century, right, is remarkable and astounding, right? It also speaks to one of the great issues that comes involved with economic factors, right? Or the strategy that American capitalism has put forward, which is that you must climb the ladder slightly so that your children may climb the ladder slightly more, right? Is that then we then waste the talent of people who are forced to climb that ladder, right? And we see this all the time, right? Of where people that are in poverty, because they are asked to then help take care of their family, or they have, you know, an unexpected pregnancy or unexpected children, things like that, right? They are forced to give up those artistic or creative pursuits and use those actual talents that they have to then work, right? And, you know, it's just one of those things, right, of where it's a very big critique on the way that we express ourselves through monetary value, right? And that we are inherently reliant on monetary value to exist, right? And then we get Biff. Biff is the last one. Biff is more or less the one that we visualize as being the far right character. He also, like, weirdly enough, does things that we now also consider far right, like having a very having a great obsession or attraction to Japanese culture, which is often associated at this point in time with right-wing ideologies, which is, I understand where the connection comes from, but it's just a weird connection that exists, but that also exists within the Heart of the Lonely Hunter. But Biff kind of ends this with like just this, you know, he so close to having this great, beautiful realization, and then he suppresses it because it goes against the status quo, right? He is finally about to like make some sort of this great revelation about humanity and mankind and the way that we treat one another. And instead of following that, he dismisses it as frivolous and therefore ignores it and just moves on with his life, right? Which falls very much in line with this, you know, what we can generally consider I shouldn't say far right, but right-winged kind of ideology, right, in American society, which is the status quo should be upheld and that we shouldn't change things, right? And that's that. All right, that is a lot of my thoughts on The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. It's a very lovely book. This is not a read a few pages book. This is a you have to read a couple chapters at a time book. This book really explores, right, this kind of relationship between economics, gender, sexual identity, race, right, disability. It explores how all these things kind of interact, and how no matter how oppressed a group of people is, there's always a desire to make an inside group and an outside group, no matter what. It is always an us and them, right? No matter who is talking, right? And that's that. Right? That is Carson McCullers' The Heart is a Lonely Hunter.